It was a bright Monday morning in September when 7-year-old Amara Johnson walked into Riverside Elementary School with a big smile on her face. Her mother had spent the entire weekend doing her hair in beautiful box braids, decorated with small purple beads that made soft clicking sounds when she moved her head. Amara felt pretty and confident as she looked at herself in the hallway mirror before entering her second-grade classroom. Miss Peterson's classroom was already busy with activity when Amara walked in. The walls were covered with colorful multiplication tables and student artwork, but something felt different that morning. As Amara made her way to her desk in the third row, she noticed Miss Peterson watching her with narrowed eyes. "Amara," Miss Peterson called out sharply, making several students turn around. "Those beads in your hair are making too much noise. They're distracting the class." Amara sat very still after that, trying not to move her head at all, even though Sarah Chen, her best friend who sat next to her, whispered that she couldn't hear anything. During the morning math lesson, Amara raised her hand to answer a question about multiplication. She knew the answer. 7 times 8 was 56, but before she could say it, Miss Peterson made another comment. "Amara, how can anyone focus on math when your hair is moving around like that?" Some kids in the class giggled, making Amara's cheeks feel hot. She slowly lowered her hand and stared at her desk, her earlier confidence disappearing like morning fog. Sarah reached under the desk and squeezed her hand, but Amara couldn't squeeze back. Her throat felt tight, and her eyes started to burn with tears she refused to let fall. When it was time for arts and crafts, the class was working on fall-themed collages with colored paper and glitter. Amara was carefully cutting out an orange leaf shape when she felt something touch the back of her head. Before she could turn around, there was a sudden tugging sensation, followed by a sharp snipping sound that seemed to echo in her ears. The classroom went completely quiet. Amara reached back and touched her hair, her fingers trembling. Where several of her braids had been, she now felt uneven, short patches. On the floor beside her desk lay her beautiful braids, the purple beads scattered across the linoleum like tiny grape candies. Miss Peterson stood behind her, holding a pair of silver scissors. "The beads and braids are against school policy," she announced to the silent classroom. "They're not appropriate for a learning environment." Her voice was calm as if she had just erased a chalkboard or handed out worksheets, not cut off a child's hair without permission. Tommy Martinez, who sat 2 rows over, had his phone out under his desk. His older brother had given it to him for emergencies, and even though students weren't supposed to use phones in class, he was recording everything. His hands shook slightly as he pointed the camera at the scattered braids on the floor. Amara couldn't move. She couldn't speak. She felt like she was floating above her desk, watching everything happen to someone else. Sarah had tears running down her face, and other students were whispering and pointing. Even James Wilson, who usually slept through class, was wide awake and staring with his mouth open. "Go to the nurse's office, Amara," Miss Peterson said, putting the scissors back on her desk. "Have her call your mother about proper school attire." Amara stood up slowly, her legs feeling wobbly like they did after jumping too long on a trampoline. As she walked to the door, she heard Kelly Thompson whisper, "That's so wrong." But no one said anything louder. No one stopped her. No one stopped Miss Peterson. In the hallway, Amara touched her hair again. Her mother had spent 6 hours doing these braids, telling her stories about how her own mother used to braid her hair, and how braiding was part of their history, their culture. Now pieces of that history lay scattered on Miss Peterson's classroom floor. What Amara didn't know, as she walked numbly toward the nurse's office, was that Tommy's video was already being sent to his older brother. She didn't know that Sarah had sneaked out her own phone during the confusion and was texting her sister, who ran a popular social media account. She didn't know that in less than an hour, her story would begin spreading across the internet like wildfire, reaching people far beyond the walls of Riverside Elementary. All Amara knew was that her beautiful braids were gone, and the confident girl who had walked into school that morning felt like she had disappeared too. The school nurse, Mrs. Garcia, was organizing band-aids in her cabinet when Amara walked into her office. One look at the young girl's uneven hair and tear-stained face made her drop the box she was holding. Band-aids scattered across the floor, but Mrs. Garcia didn't even notice. She had been a school nurse for 20 years, but she had never seen anything like this. "Oh, sweetheart," Mrs. Garcia said softly, guiding Amara to the small blue cot in the corner. "What happened?" but Amara couldn't speak. Her hands kept touching the back of her head where her braids used to be, and fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. Meanwhile, in the classroom, Tommy Martinez's video had already reached his brother Carlos, a senior at the local high school. Carlos was sitting in his history class when he got the message. His hand shot up immediately. "Family emergency," he told his teacher, and rushed out to the hallway. With shaking hands, he posted the video on every social media platform he could think of, adding the caption, "Teacher at Riverside Elementary cuts off a black student's braids during class. This is happening right now." Sarah Chen's sister Lisa, a popular fashion blogger with thousands of followers, saw the video and immediately shared it. She added her own message. "This is my sister's best friend. The teacher had been making comments about her hair all morning before this happened. Someone needs to be held responsible." Back in the nurse's office, Mrs. Garcia was on the phone with Dr. Michelle Johnson, Amara's mother. "Dr. Johnson, you need to come to the school immediately," she said, keeping her voice low so Amara couldn't hear. "There's been an incident involving your daughter." Dr. Johnson was in the middle of a patient consultation when she got the call. As soon as she heard what happened, she canceled all her remaining appointments. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her car keys, and she nearly ran 3 red lights on her way to the school. By the time Dr. Johnson arrived at Riverside Elementary, the video had been shared thousands of times. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from friends and family who had seen it. The school's front office was already getting calls from local news stations. Principal Roberts was waiting in the office, his face pale and sweaty. He tried to explain that there must have been some misunderstanding, that Ms. Peterson was a respected teacher with 20 years of experience. But his words died in his throat when he saw the look on Dr. Johnson's face. "Where is my daughter?" Dr. Johnson's voice was quiet but firm. The secretary pointed toward the nurse's office, and Dr. Johnson walked past them without another word. When Amara saw her mother walk in, she finally broke down completely. Dr. Johnson wrapped her arms around her daughter, feeling the places where the braids had been cut off. Each uneven patch felt like a punch to her stomach. She had spent hours doing those braids, telling Amara about their family history, about the strength and beauty of their culture. Now her daughter sat crying in her arms, pieces of her identity scattered on a classroom floor. Mrs. Garcia handed Dr. Johnson a plastic bag containing the cut braids and beads that a student had collected. The purple beads made a soft clicking sound in the bag, the same sound that Ms. Peterson had called distracting. Outside the nurse's office, the hallways were buzzing with whispers. Students who passed by pressed their faces against the window, trying to get a glimpse of what was happening. The video had made its way through the entire school now. Even the kindergartners knew something big had happened. Sarah Chen stood outside the nurse's office, refusing to go back to class. Her sister Lisa had already shown up at the school, phone in hand, documenting everything. Other parents were starting to arrive too, demanding answers from the administration. The local news van pulled up outside the school just as Dr. Johnson walked out of the nurse's office, carrying Amara. Teachers peeked out of their classrooms, watching in silence. Miss Peterson's classroom door remained closed, but everyone could see her through the window, sitting at her desk, still holding the scissors that had changed everything. No one knew it yet, but this was just the beginning. The video was already reaching national news outlets, and social media was exploding with outrage. In just a few hours, the quiet halls of Riverside Elementary would become the center of a storm that would change not just their school, but schools across the country. By the next morning, the video of Ms. Peterson cutting Amara's braids had been viewed millions of times. News vans lined the street in front of Riverside Elementary, their satellite dishes reaching into the gray morning sky like metal trees. Reporters stood in front of the school, talking into microphones about discrimination, cultural awareness, and the need for change. Dr. Johnson sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone. She had received over 500 messages from people across the country. Some shared similar stories about their children facing discrimination at school. Others offered to help her find a good lawyer. Many just wanted to express their support and outrage. Upstairs, Amara lay in her bed, unable to sleep. Her hands kept touching the uneven patches in her hair where her braids used to be. Her mother had tried to fix it the best she could, but it wasn't the same. The purple beads sat in a small bowl on her bedside table, quiet now, no longer making the gentle clicking sounds she had loved so much. Sarah Chen and her family arrived at the Johnson house early that morning. Sarah's mother brought breakfast, and her sister Lisa was already busy organizing a peaceful protest outside the school. "We stand with Amara," Lisa wrote on her social media, and within hours, thousands of people had promised to join them. At the school, Principal Roberts was having an emergency meeting with the school board. The district's lawyers sat around the table, their faces serious as they watched the video for the 10th time. Miss Peterson wasn't there. She had called in sick, but everyone knew she was hiding from the reporters camped outside her house. "We need to release a statement," one of the lawyers said, pushing his glasses up his nose. Principal Roberts nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead with a tissue. But before they could decide what to say, something unexpected happened. Other students from Riverside Elementary started sharing their own stories. A fifth-grade girl named Maria told her parents about how Miss Peterson had made fun of her accent last year. James, a third grader, talked about how she had thrown away his traditional Indian lunch because it smelled too strong. Each news story was like adding wood to a fire that was already burning hot. By lunchtime, hundreds of people had gathered outside the school. They carried signs that read, "Protect our children," and "Black hair is beautiful." Parents from other schools joined the protest, bringing their children who wore their hair in braids, afros, and other natural styles. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing the growing crowd. Dr. Johnson hadn't planned to speak to the media, but when she saw all the people who had come to support her daughter, she knew she had to say something. Standing on the steps of Riverside Elementary, with Amara holding her hand tightly, she spoke into a forest of microphones. "This isn't just about hair," she said, her voice strong and clear. "This is about respect. This is about letting our children be proud of who they are. This is about making sure no child ever has to feel the way my daughter felt yesterday." The crowd cheered, and Amara looked up at her mother with tears in her eyes. But these weren't sad tears like yesterday. These were different. She saw people who looked like her, and people who didn't, all standing together. She saw Sarah and her family holding signs with her name on them. She saw her classmates and their parents. She even saw Tommy Martinez and his brother Carlos, who had helped share her story. As the day went on, more supporters arrived. Famous athletes and actresses tweeted about Amara's story. Civil rights leaders called for Ms. Peterson to be fired and for new laws to be passed protecting students from discrimination. The small incident in a second-grade classroom had become something much bigger. By sunset, the crowd had grown so large that the police had to close the street. But they weren't there to stop the protest. Many of the officers had brought their own families to join in. The message was clear. What happened to Amara couldn't be ignored or forgotten. That night, as Amara finally fell asleep, the gentle glow of candlelight flickered outside her window. Hundreds of people stood in a quiet vigil, holding candles and promising that tomorrow would be different. Not just for Amara, but for every child who had ever been made to feel ashamed of who they were. 1 week after the incident, the Johnson family sat in the office of Marcus Richardson, one of the city's best civil rights lawyers. The walls of his office were covered with photographs of historic moments in the fight for equality. Amara sat between her parents, wearing a beautiful head wrap that her grandmother had sent her from Atlanta. "What happened to your daughter wasn't just wrong," Marcus said, his deep voice filled with determination. "It was against the law." He spread several papers across his desk, pointing to different sections that he had highlighted in bright yellow. "We have enough evidence to file a major lawsuit." What Marcus didn't tell them right away was that more information about Ms. Peterson had started coming out. Former students, now adults, had begun sharing their own stories on social media. There were dozens of complaints about her behavior over the years, all buried deep in the school's files. Each story was like finding another piece of a puzzle that showed a clear pattern of discrimination. Meanwhile, at Riverside Elementary, things were very different. Ms. Peterson was on paid leave, and a substitute teacher named Mr. Jackson had taken over her class. He was young and energetic, with dreadlocks that he tied back neatly. On his first day, he had the students sit in a circle and talk about their feelings about everything that had happened. "My mom says Miss Peterson should go to jail," Tommy Martinez said during the discussion. Several other students nodded in agreement. Sarah Chen raised her hand and asked if Amara would ever come back to their class. Mr. Jackson didn't have an answer, but he promised to make sure everyone felt safe and respected in his classroom. The school board called an emergency meeting that filled the local community center. Hundreds of parents packed the room, many holding signs and wearing t-shirts that said "Justice for Amara." Dr. Johnson sat in the front row, surrounded by other parents whose children had faced discrimination at school. During the meeting, shocking details emerged. The school had received complaints about Ms. Peterson's behavior for years, but nothing had been done. Principal Roberts had known about some of these incidents but had chosen to ignore them. Parents stood up one after another, sharing stories that made the room buzz with angry whispers. The state's Department of Education sent investigators to review everything. They spent days going through files, interviewing teachers and staff, and examining the school's policies. What they found was troubling. There was no clear policy about cultural sensitivity, no proper system for handling complaints, and no required training for teachers about diversity. Back at the lawyer's office, Marcus showed the Johnsons a video that had been sent to him. It was from a security camera in the school hallway, recorded 3 days before the incident. It showed Ms. Peterson arguing with another teacher who had defended a student's right to wear traditional African clothing for a class presentation. This proves she had a problem with cultural expression before what happened to Amara, Marcus explained. It shows a pattern of behavior that the school ignored. Dr. Johnson watched the video with tears in her eyes, thinking about how many other children might have been hurt before someone finally stood up. The local teachers' union released a statement distancing themselves from Ms. Peterson. They announced new programs to train teachers about cultural sensitivity and the importance of respecting students' identities. Other schools in the district began reviewing their own policies, not wanting to face similar problems. Ms. Peterson finally broke her silence, sending a letter to the school board. She claimed she was just following school policy about distracting accessories, but the board quickly pointed out that no such policy existed. Her letter only made things worse, showing she still didn't understand why her actions were wrong. Amara, now attending a different school across town, was slowly starting to smile again. Her new teachers had welcomed her warmly, and the principal had even asked her to help create new school rules about respecting different cultures. Her story had become a lesson for everyone about the importance of standing up against discrimination. The lawsuit was just beginning, but it was already clear that this case would change things. Not just at Riverside Elementary, but at schools everywhere. Sometimes it takes one brave little girl and one terrible moment to show everyone what needs to change. A month had passed since the incident, and Amara sat in her new therapist's office, drawing pictures with bright-colored markers. Dr. Rachel's office was different from other doctors' offices. It had comfortable bean bags instead of stiff chairs, and the walls were covered with children's artwork. Today, Amara was drawing a picture of herself with long, beautiful braids reaching up to the sun. "Tell me about your drawing," Dr. Rachel said softly, sitting cross-legged on the floor next to Amara. Her gentle voice made it easy for Amara to talk, even about the hard things. "This is how I want my hair to look when it grows back," Amara explained, reaching for a purple marker. "Mom says it will take time. That's okay. Grandmother says our hair is like a garden. It needs patience and love to grow." At home, Dr. Johnson had turned their living room into what she called the Hair Love Station. Every evening, she and Amara would try different ways to style her growing hair. They watched videos about hair care together, and Amara started keeping a journal where she drew pictures of all the styles she wanted to try someday. Sarah Chen visited almost every day after school. She had started learning about black hair care and history, asking her mother to buy books about it. One afternoon, she came over with a special gift, a handmade book filled with photos of famous black women with different hairstyles. "Look, Amara," Sarah said excitedly, pointing to the pictures. "All these amazing women wear their hair in so many beautiful ways, and they're all scientists, doctors, and leaders, just like your mom." Amara hugged the book to her chest, feeling a warmth spread through her heart. At her new school, Riverside Heights Elementary, Amara was making new friends. Her new teacher, Ms. Washington, had started a club called Cultural Champions, where students could share stories about their families and traditions. Amara's story had inspired the club, but it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone's right to be proud of who they were. Tommy Martinez and his brother Carlos still kept in touch. They had started a student group at their schools called Stand Together that worked to stop bullying and discrimination. The video Carlos had posted now had over 10 million views, and they were invited to speak at other schools about standing up for what's right. One sunny Saturday, Amara's grandmother came to visit from Atlanta. She brought with her an old photo album filled with pictures of their family through the generations. Each photo showed different hairstyles, braids, twists, afros, and each one had a story. Your great-grandmother wore her hair like this when she marched for civil rights, her grandmother explained, pointing to a black and white photo. And now you, my brave girl, are making history too. Amara traced the photo with her finger, feeling connected to a long line of strong women. Dr. Johnson noticed changes in her daughter. Amara was talking more, laughing more. In her therapy sessions with Dr. Rachel, she had started writing stories about a superhero called Hair Power Girl who helped other kids feel proud of their differences. Dr. Rachel thought the stories were so good that she asked Amara if she could share them with other children who were dealing with similar experiences. The local library invited Amara to do a reading of her stories. She stood at the front of the children's section, wearing a beautiful new head wrap decorated with butterflies, and read her stories to a room full of children and parents. When she finished, a little girl with braids just like Amara used to have raised her hand. "Are you scared to wear your hair however you want now?" the girl asked quietly. Amara thought for a moment before answering. "I was scared at first," she said honestly. "But then I learned something important. Our hair is part of our story, and every story, even the scary parts, can make us stronger." That evening, as Amara got ready for bed, she looked at herself in the mirror. Her hair was growing back differently now. Some parts were longer than others, like a garden with plants at different stages of growth. But when she smiled at her reflection, she didn't see the uneven patches anymore. She saw strength, she saw beauty, she saw herself. 2 months after the incident, the halls of Riverside Elementary looked very different. New posters lined the walls, showing children of all backgrounds with different hairstyles and cultural dress. The school board had been busy making big changes, and today was the first day of their new cultural training program for all teachers and staff. In the school library, teachers sat in rows of chairs, many taking notes as Dr. Gloria Martinez, a well-known expert on cultural education, spoke to them. "What happened in these halls 2 months ago," she said, pointing to a news photo of Amara, "should never happen again. Today, we start learning how to make sure it doesn't." Principal Roberts sat in the back row, looking different from the nervous man who had tried to dismiss the incident months ago. The investigation had revealed his failure to address previous complaints, and he had almost lost his job. Now, he was on probation and had to prove he could be a better leader. "I failed our students," he admitted when it was his turn to speak. His voice shook as he talked. "But we can't change the past. What we can do is make sure the future is different." Some teachers wiped tears from their eyes as he spoke, remembering how they had stayed silent when they should have spoken up. The new school policies were strict and clear. No staff member could comment on or touch a student's hair or cultural expression. Every teacher had to take monthly training sessions about different cultures. The dress code was completely rewritten with help from parents of all backgrounds. At the state capitol building, something even bigger was happening. Dr. Johnson stood next to the governor as he signed a new law called the Crown Act, which made it illegal to discriminate against anyone because of their hair in all schools across the state. Amara's story had helped push the law forward faster than anyone expected. "This law is named Car-O-Lan for a reason," the governor said during the signing ceremony, "because every child deserves to wear their crown of hair with pride." Cameras flashed as he handed the signing pen to Dr. Johnson, who had become a powerful voice for change. Back at Riverside Elementary, the changes weren't just on paper. The school had started hosting monthly cultural celebration days, where students and their families could share their traditions, food, and stories. The first celebration had been so popular that other schools in the district wanted to copy the idea. Miss Peterson's old classroom had been transformed. The new teacher, Mr. Jackson, had worked with his students to create a wall of pride, where pictures of different hairstyles, cultural dress, and family traditions were displayed. Under each picture was a story written by a student about what their culture meant to them. Sarah Chen's sister Lisa had helped create a special website called Our Hair, Our Story, where students from all over the country could share their experiences and learn about different cultural hairstyles. The site had thousands of visitors every day, and schools were using it as a teaching tool. The The school district created a new position called Cultural Diversity Coordinator and hired Mrs. Diaz, a former teacher who had been fighting for these changes for years. Her job was to make sure all schools were following the new rules and to help teachers learn about their students' cultures. One day, a news crew came back to Riverside Elementary to film a follow-up story. They found a very different school from the one they had reported on 2 months ago. In the cafeteria, students sat in mixed groups, asking questions about each other's lunches and traditions. In the hallways, teachers greeted students in different languages. The biggest change, Mrs. Diaz told the reporters, isn't just in the rules or the training. It's in how people think and act now. Our students are teaching us as much as we're teaching them. The reporter asked to interview some students about the changes. A third grader named Michael raised his hand. Before, some kids were scared to be different, he said. Now we know that being different is what makes our school special. As the camera crew packed up their equipment, they noticed something symbolic. The scissors Ms. Peterson had used that day were gone from the school. In their place was a new sign above the main office that read, "At Riverside Elementary, every story matters, every culture counts, and every child belongs." 3 months after the incident, Ms. Peterson sat alone in her small apartment, surrounded by stacks of newspapers. Each one had stories about what she had done. She hadn't left her home much since that day, afraid to face people who recognized her from the news. Her once neat living room was now filled with delivery boxes and unopened mail. The lawsuit against her and the school was moving forward. Her teacher's license had been suspended, and she had to attend mandatory cultural sensitivity training sessions. At first, she had been angry, telling herself she had done nothing wrong. But as the weeks passed, something began to change inside her. Today was different. Miss Peterson had agreed to meet with Dr. Williams, a respected black educator who specialized in helping teachers understand their biases. She hadn't wanted to go, but her lawyer said it might help her case. What she didn't expect was how this meeting would change everything. "Tell me about that day," Dr. Williams said gently, sitting across from her in his office. There were no accusations in his voice, no anger. Just a simple question that made Ms. Peterson really think about what she had done for the first time. "I thought I was following the rules," she started, but then stopped. "No, that's not true," she admitted, surprising herself. "I was annoyed by the beads clicking. But now I understand. I was annoyed because I didn't understand what they meant." Dr. Williams showed her videos about the history of black hair, the cultural significance of braiding, and the deep connection between hair and identity. Miss Peterson watched as mothers and daughters talked about bonding over hair care, just like Amara and her mother had done. "I never knew," she whispered, tears rolling down her face. "In 20 years of teaching, I never took the time to learn about my students' cultures. I just expected everyone to fit into my idea of what was right." The next session was harder. Dr. Williams had invited other teachers to share stories about how they learned to appreciate different cultures in their classrooms. One teacher, Mrs. Chen, talked about how she had changed her classroom after realizing she had her own biases. "I used to think some names were too hard to pronounce," Mrs. Chen admitted. "Then I realized that by not trying, I was telling those students their identity wasn't important enough to learn." Miss Peterson thought about all the names she had changed over the years, all the times she had made students feel like they needed to be different to fit in. Each memory felt like a heavy stone in her heart. The turning point came when Dr. Williams showed her the video of Amara telling her story at the library. Watching the little girl speak about feeling proud of her hair again, Miss Peterson finally broke down completely. "I want to make this right," she said through her tears. "I know I can't take back what I did, but I want to learn. I want to be better." Dr. Williams helped her write a real apology letter, not like the defensive one she had sent to the school board. This time, she took full responsibility for her actions and their impact. She wrote about what she had learned and how she wanted to help prevent other teachers from making the same mistakes. The letter was shared during a special meeting with civil rights leaders and education experts. Many were surprised by her honesty and willingness to learn. While it didn't erase what she had done, it showed that change was possible, even for someone who had been set in their ways for so long. Miss Peterson started volunteering at a cultural education center, sharing her story as a warning about the damage unconscious bias can cause. She spoke to teaching students about the importance of understanding and respecting their future students' cultures. I'm not asking for forgiveness, she would tell them. I'm asking you to learn from my mistake. Every child deserves to feel proud of who they are, and it's our job as teachers to protect that pride, not destroy it. One afternoon, as she finished speaking to a group of future teachers, a young black woman approached her. I'm studying to be a teacher, she said. And hearing your story reminds me why it's so important to have teachers who understand their students' cultures. Ms. Peterson nodded, touching the small photo of Amara she now kept in her wallet as a reminder. Understanding isn't just about knowing, she said quietly. It's about caring enough to learn. 1 year had passed since the day Ms. Peterson cut Amara's braids. The calendars now showed September again, and Amara stood in front of her bedroom mirror, smiling at her reflection. Her hair had grown back beautifully, now styled in elaborate cornrows with golden beads that caught the morning light. Are you ready for your big day? Dr. Johnson asked, standing in the doorway. Today wasn't just any school day, it was the first day of the annual Cultural Leadership Conference, and 8-year-old Amara was one of the keynote speakers. The conference was being held at the city's largest hotel, and children from schools all across the country had come to attend. Some of them had faced similar experiences to Amara's, while others were there to learn how to be better allies to their classmates. Sarah Chen was already waiting in the hotel lobby when Amara arrived. The two best friends had stayed close even though they now went to different schools. Sarah had helped Amara practice her speech for weeks, and she wore a t-shirt that said, "Every crown matters," the slogan from their successful awareness campaign. Tommy Martinez and his brother Carlos were there too, manning a booth where they showed their viral video and talked about the importance of speaking up when you see something wrong. Their Stand Together movement had spread to over 50 schools now, teaching students how to use social media responsibly to fight discrimination. The conference room was packed with people. Teachers, parents, students, and education officials filled every seat. Dr. Johnson sat in the front row, next to Marcus Richardson, the civil rights lawyer who had helped them win their lawsuit. The settlement money had been used to create a foundation that provided cultural education programs to schools. When it was Amara's turn to speak, she walked to the podium with confidence. The golden beads in her hair made soft, musical sounds, the same sounds that had once been called distracting, but were now celebrated as beautiful. My story began with scissors, Amara started, her voice clear and strong, but it didn't end there. It became a story about standing up, speaking out, and making change happen. She shared how the incident had led to new laws protecting cultural expression in schools across 5 states, with more states working on similar legislation. In the middle of her speech, Amara paused as she noticed someone slip quietly into the back of the room. It was Ms. Peterson, there at Amara's own invitation. After months of cultural education and genuine change, Amara had decided to show what forgiveness and growth looked like. Change isn't just about rules and laws, Amara continued, sharing a knowing look with Ms. Peterson. It's about understanding each other. It's about learning from mistakes and making sure they don't happen again. After the speech, there was a special ceremony. Students from different cultures took turns showing their traditional hairstyles and clothing, explaining what each element meant to their families and communities. The audience learned about box braids, hijabs, bindis, indigenous headdresses, and many other cultural expressions that were now protected in schools. Principal Roberts, who had kept his job by proving his commitment to change, presented Amara with an award named in her honor, the Johnson Cultural Leadership Award. It would be given each year to a student who helped promote cultural understanding in their school. Later that evening, at a small celebration in the Johnson home, Amara's grandmother brought out the family photo album again. But this time, there was a new photo to add. One of Amara speaking at the conference, her hairstyle just like her great-grandmother's had been in the old Civil Rights March photo. "You've added your own beautiful chapter to our family's story," her grandmother said proudly, carefully placing the photo in the album. As the sun set on that remarkable day, Amara sat on her back porch with Sarah, both girls eating celebration cake. They watched younger kids playing in the neighborhood, girls and boys of all backgrounds proudly wearing their hair in different styles without fear. "Do you ever think about that day?" Sarah asked quietly, meaning the day of the incident. Amara touched one of her golden beads thoughtfully. "Sometimes," she replied. "But mostly I think about all the days that came after, the days when we learned that one person's story can help write a better ending for everyone." And she was right. Her story had changed more than just rules and laws. It changed hearts and minds. In schools across the country, children now learned that their differences weren't just to be tolerated, but celebrated. All because one brave little girl had turned a moment of pain into a movement of positive change.